to see. Thank you so much for joining us. This series is designed to promote the new publications, the new book publications of members of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. My name is Melanie O'Brien, and I am the current president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, or IAGS for short. These webinars are a series which you can find on the IAGS YouTube channel and linked through our website, genocidescholars.org. It is my pleasure today to introduce our author and our discussant to you. Our author is Daniel Feierstein, who is a sociologist and the director of the Center for Genocide Studies at the National University of 3 de Febrero in Buenos Aires in Argentina. Daniel served one term each as second vice president, first vice president, and president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and he is currently a member of the advisory board. He has consulted for the United Nations on several projects and chaired the Permanent People's Tribunals on Sri Lanka and Myanmar. Daniel's work focuses on the Argentine military junta's crimes and on genocidal social practices. His previous book, which I have here, Genocide as Social Practice, Reorganizing Society Under the Nazis and Argentina's Military Juntas, which was published in 2014, is a seminal work in the genocide studies canon. And I can only say that if you do not have this on your bookshelf, that you should definitely get it because it informs all areas of genocide studies. And I'm really looking forward tonight to hearing about his new book. Our discussant tonight is Dr. Carse Ramos, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Rhode Island College in the United States. Dr. Ramos was previously the primary research consultant for the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law's Atrocity Prevention Legal Training Project and an external lecturer on minority rights at ELTE University in Budapest in Hungary. She earned her PhD in Anthropology and Sociology of Development at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, where her dissertation focused on Uganda's transitional justice policy and its mechanisms for navigating the overlapping victim-perpetrator spaces occupied by former child conscripts. Her research is located at the nexus between atrocity prevention, legal spaces, transitional justice, and social memory, with a particular lens on victimhood designation process. She's currently working on two projects, one the adjudication of socialization processes in international criminal trials, and the other on memory politics in several countries. So I think you will agree there's a great complementarity of expertise between our author and our discussant today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussion between these two learned specialist sociologist academics. And on that note, it is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Dr. Carse Ramos.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Greetings from Virginia. I am very pleased and honored to be having this discussion with Daniel this morning about his very interesting and important new book. So a bit in the way of introduction, the book is entitled Memories and Representations of Terror, Working Through Genocide. It is the first of a 3-volume work. The book examines how memories and representations of genocide are the terrain in which both the strategic objectives of genocide and the possibilities of challenging those objectives are contested. I took that bit from the book's description because I couldn't say it better. But in doing so, he looks at how memory and narrative are constructed and reconstructed, not only as purely social and historiographical phenomena, but also as neuroscientific and psychoanalytic processes. He raises several compelling points regarding both our understanding and our use of memory and narratives, many of which, particularly in those latter two fields, I've never thought about before. And so I'm very excited and grateful to be involved in this discussion. And I look forward to the next hour to come. So should we launch into it, or would you like to add anything?
No, that's okay. Just thank you. Thank Melanie, for the invitation, and thank you, Carse, for your thoughtful reading of the book. I'm excited to start a conversation about it, about what questions the book has provoked you. So just go ahead.
So the first, I had many questions come up while reading the book. And the first is that in your book, you discuss the phenomenon of memory as being constructed. And so while this is something that sociologists and others have, including myself, have looked at as a social function, you take this novel approach of also exploring this as a neurological and psychoanalytic at these levels. Can you tell us a little bit about how memory is stored in the brain and how this reconstruction functions in that sphere?
Yes, it's a fundamental question, Carse, because when I started my research on the subject, my idea is that sociologists and even historians used to do some assumptions about how the memory work in different moments in which there was no real knowledge until the last 30 years, I would say that there was no real knowledge about how does it work at an, I would say, at a biological level, at an organic level. But some of our assumptions were wrong. And that's interesting because what is true is that memory is a social construction, but this kind of construction is different than we thought. So I will tell you some of the elements that are in the first chapter. First, there is no possibility to store scenes in our brain. There is not that way. This idea that we live things, we store those things, and then we remember these things, that is something that it is in our intuition, but it is absolutely wrong. The way in which we can store, there is a possibility to imprint, but the way in which we imprint memory is absolutely fragmentary. So we have the possibility to imprint images, and we have the possibility to imprint words, and we have the possibility to imprint some emotions. But the scene, the idea of the scene we have lived is a creative construction. It is not stored. It is a construction in which we can put together these different fragmentary elements that are stored in our brain. But this way of reconstruction is a social process, is a kind of, is a creation. That's why when we have lived the same event together, if we are 20 people, we will have 20 slightly different versions of the event, because any reconstruction will be different, because it is a creative act in which we can put together these different fragments. But there are some things that guide the process, and that is also interesting. First, the main objective of the reconstruction is the search for coherence and meaning. So we have different fragmentary imprints. Reality is absolutely chaotic, and we are always trying to give coherence to this, even at the price of distorting these fragments store in order, or maybe to add something which is not there in order to give coherence and meaning. The second element is that we used to project the present to the past. So when we remember ourselves in the past, it is not really ourselves in the past, but it is ourselves in the present projected to the past, which is really interesting because we are not always the same. But the interesting point is that we are projecting Daniel Feierstein, 56 years old, to a moment in which it was Daniel Feierstein, 25 years old. But it is not Daniel Feierstein, 25 years old. It is the 56, as if I would have 26 or 25. So that's that's interesting as the second element. And the third is that usually these reconstructions has also the need to sustain our narcissism. So it is in order that we are going to create a version in which, again, it is slight distortion, but we are trying to create a version of this narrative in which our role is much more important if it was a good role, or maybe less important if it was a very bad role. So the idea is just trying to move a little bit the possibility to sustain our narcissism. That's the current style. So these different elements that coming from the ways in which the research about the way in which memory works at a biological neuroscientific level, it is fundamental to put in connection with the sociological hypothesis. And that was my main objective. So maybe we can talk about that in the end, but I had to study neurosciences coming from the sociology in order to a better understanding of the way in which memory works at that level, which is not my level, as psychoanalysis is not my level either, but we need those levels in order to understand. And my concern was that usually sociologists, historians talk about memory without any kind of knowledge about these levels that are fundamental to create a real sociological approach regarding the memory processes.
And I will say, as a sociologist, I am absolutely guilty of that. And one of the things that I found so interesting about this first chapter is that it made me think of conversations that we have sort of within sociology about memory as a dynamic function, right? Memory as something that changes, not wholesale, of course, but if we are taking ourselves in the present and sort of projecting ourselves back, or if we are trying to make coherence out of the current chaos, then of course it's going to be slightly different every time we go back and sort of filter through which of these fragments to choose to put together. And so I found that both very interesting, but also very helpful, and something that I'd not really encountered before. And so that was incredibly instructive, and thank you. In the second chapter, I don't want to say shift, because the book reads in such a way that it's all sort of part of a process going from beginning to end. But in the second chapter, you turn to examine the relationship between memory and history through a psychoanalytic lens. And one of the things that I found most compelling in this chapter was your discussion on trauma in this context. And so you note perceptively that, and for those who are listening, I'm taking this quote from the book, that trauma is produced and renewed as a social and historical experience. And you go on to discuss the inherently social nature of individual psychological processes. You then say, and again, quoting from the book, trauma originates in a historical and social situation, historical in terms of the time and social in terms of interactions with others, and its consequences are manifested in the individual psyche. And so could you expound on this idea?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, both chapters, the first regarding neuroscientific approaches and the second regarding psychoanalytical, is interesting because in both cases, sociologists are right when we say that memory is a construction and when we say that trauma is always social. However, it is not right the way in which we usually analyze this question. So it is okay that it is a construction, but the way in which we construct, now we know that speaking from the neuroscientific level, it is wrong, the how it is constructed. It is the same regarding this question of the social character of trauma. So I would say that there are many authors who talked about social trauma. And I think that this is really a problematic concept, because there is nothing like social trauma, because trauma is a concept which was created to analyze the psychic, so the psychoanalytical level, the psychic level. So trauma is something which happens in our psychic apparatus. So social trauma would mean that the society has the psychic apparatus, and there is nothing like that. So there is no social trauma, but trauma is produced in social relations. So trauma is, there is no social trauma, but trauma is not really individual, is imprinted in our psychic apparatus, and that is individual, but the production of the situation that generates the trauma is social, involved our social relationships, and the working through is also social. So why? Because we exchange with others, but the others are part of our psychic apparatus. So the others are inside us. So it is impossible to think ourselves without those others. And that's the way in which there is no social trauma, but the trauma is social, which is not the same. So that's why, in my opinion, it is really important in this idea to take the different approaches to understand that reality means the possibility to think with all the levels together. So translations from one level to the other, and that in reality, there is nothing like neuroscience or psychology or sociology or history, because everything works together. So this taxonomy of disciplines means that we do an act of abstraction in order to a better understanding, but then we need to put everything together. For doing that, we need to really understand the different levels. So I think that there is an epistemological obstacle here, that this very detailed specialization of disciplines from the last 30, 40 years means that everyone is an expert in a very tiny part of reality, but without the real knowledge of the rest of the levels that are playing in this reality, we cannot really understand. So I think it is much more challenging, but it is not interdisciplinary, that each members of the disciplines comes and explain, okay, that's the way it works in my field. But then we need to intertwine the levels. For doing that, we need to understand all the levels. And that was the main concern of the whole project, because the book is the first volume of a trilogy I'm working with. The second was already published in Spanish. I'm working with the third. And the whole trilogy, the idea is to intertwine these different levels in order to understand the working through genocide.
In listening to you speak, it makes me think of many people. We talk about academia being so siloed, right? But in essence, what you're suggesting is that it goes beyond certain disciplinary divides, and really we're approaching not just academia, but reality in this sort of siloed way, right? Which is inherently limiting. And so I want to move forward a bit to talk about after chapter 2, we delve more into the social areas, which is obviously where I felt a little bit more in my element. And so these questions might be a little more granular, but you differentiate in genocide from war and crimes against humanity or state terror by noting that genocide aims to restructure society, right? And so this would seemingly extend, and so it's not just the impact on victims, it's not the magnitude, it's the fundamental sort of goal of restructuring that is specific to genocidal products. And so this would, projects, I mean. So this would seemingly extend to related concepts like politicide and femicide, possibly others. But would it not also be a function of something like a civil war? And so I was reading, I was thinking, you know, the type of fundamental alteration sought might be different. But the aim of fundamental alteration or restructuring seems to still be there. And so I'm hoping you could speak a little bit more about how you delineate these conceptually.
Yeah. So I would say there are two different ways to answer. So I would say from an objective viewpoint, we should differentiate between war and genocide, mainly about the way in which both kind of actions transform the social relationships. That war has the aim to defeat an enemy. So the objective is mainly to destroy social forces, usually in war and also in civil war. There are some confrontation between social forces, and the objective is that one social force has the objective to destroy or to subjugate the other social force. So in the moment the other social force is defeated, war finished, because it has its aim. In genocide, and that was very the core of Raphael Lemkin conception of genocide, is this idea that genocide is not concerned only and mainly with social forces, and it is not concerned only and mainly with the people being killed. That genocide is a technology of power to reorganize society. So it is not social forces the main target, but social relationships, which is something different, because social relationship is not one force against other force, but is the whole society, the way in which society behaves. And the objective is to transform our actions. So that's why terror is fundamental in genocide. It could be possible in war, but it is not a real need. It is fundamental and it is needed in genocide because terror is the most effective tool to transform our behavior. And that is analyzed also in the levels in the first and second chapters regarding the role of terror in neuroscientific levels and the role of terror in the psychoanalytical level. So that's the answer from, I would say, an objective viewpoint. But on the other hand, there is the subjective viewpoint, which is the way in which we create narratives. So, and in my opinion, this is much more important. That it is, how do we reconstruct the facts if we use the narrative of war, if we use the narrative of state terror or crimes against humanity, of genocide. And that's the core of the fourth chapter in the book, of the last chapter, just to differentiate these different narratives that could be produced with the same facts. So there is an objective level in which you can say, okay, this happened and this didn't happen, but then there is a subjective level in which with the same facts, we can produce different narratives, and those narratives will produce some consequences. So in this subjective level, in my opinion, genocide is much more interesting and powerful than politicide or femicide, because all these transformations affects the whole society. And that's the idea of genocide as it was developed in Lemkin's first works. This idea that genocide, the Nazi genocide, affected the whole identity of Poles, of Germans. It is not just the genocide affected the existence of Jews or Roma or Slavs or political dissidents, but that those killings were a tool to transform the rest of the society. And that is, subjectively speaking, that is absolutely different. And in crimes against humanity, in state terror, in civil war, you are always focused mainly in the direct victims. And the consequences of terror in the whole society is hidden. The interesting point of genocide is that the consequences in the whole society are there. Then the transformation of the concept with the binary understanding that political genocide is not real genocide because it is not in the convention and the political reasons should be excluded and everything. So the problem is that, and then the creation of new concepts like politicide or femicide or gendercide or whatever. The problem is that in all this understanding, this very powerful intuition of Lemkin that the real target of genocide is the whole social fabric is again hidden. So it takes the powerful of the concept and it diminishes it to a concept which is somehow similar to crimes against humanity or state terror. And that's why in this moment, sometimes it is difficult to understand why insisting on genocide when the understanding it is somehow similar to crimes against humanity or politicide or civil war or whatever. And I think that's the main difference. We should keep alive this possibility as a narrative to understand that the terror work through ourselves. The terror produced consequences in the whole society. And that's the main target of the technology of power, not the direct killings that are mainly an only tool for producing these consequences.
Thank you so much. I have two immediate thoughts on that. One is that your response flows very nicely into my next question. And the other is that I'm currently teaching a course on genocide and mass atrocity, and we are about to approach the section where we talk about going beyond the Genocide Convention. And I'm thinking that I need to clip that bit of your answer so that I can share with my students. It's an incredibly powerful concept. And so in a related way to this idea of genocide sort of being aimed at the social fabric and impacting the whole of society, you make a case, as you have elsewhere, for understanding what happened in Argentina as genocide perpetrated against the Argentine national group as a whole. And you say, again, this is from the book, rather than viewing the victims as quote unquote others with whom we can feel empathy, we recognize that the terror affects our own identity as a group. It allows us to reconceptualize terror as something that impacts us and not just others. This can be seen as a way to move beyond the typical liberal discourse that focuses on empathy for victims, and instead to consider the wider implications of massive state violence for our own identities and our own collective experiences. And again, I find this to be an incredibly powerful concept, and it links directly to your discussion in the book, for example, of different types of victims. But I'm unsure what this would look like in practice in terms of sort of you talk in the book about the moving through kind of conceptually, but as someone who looks a lot at more concrete practices, how would you envision linking this conceptual idea to something more concrete like reparations?
Yeah, I think that two or three things is a very difficult but interesting question. So two or three things to trying to answer. It is difficult to answer. So first, you are saying that we have to go beyond the Genocide Convention. I fought a lot trying to go beyond the Genocide Convention and the inclusion of political groups and whatever, for, I would say, for 20 years somehow. And then in the fight against the impunity and for justice in Argentina, I realized after this fight and after 20 years that it was the wrong way, because the main concept is inside the Genocide Convention, which is the partial destruction of the national group. That's the main target of the genocide. That's the main, and it is inside the convention. So the convention includes the idea of partial destruction of the national group, and that means any group, because particularly in modern genocide, the target of genocide is the transformation, the reorganization of the social fabric. So that means to kill some parts of the national group in order to reorganize the national group. So it is inside. And that was happened in the Argentine national courts. That a lot of courts, around 50 courts in more than 40 cases, recognize genocide in this way, with the current convention, as the partial destruction of the Argentine national group. But your question is not that one, but it is deeper, that, okay, what happened with this understanding beyond the legal level of analysis and the possibility to use the convention? What happened with this different representation? What does it mean for the society? And that's a very interesting question that I think is absolutely different for working through genocide, which is the main object of my trilogy. Is absolutely different when you believe that the problem of genocide is the problem of others, which are the direct victims who suffer the most terrible part of the genocide. So all the discussion is about your level of empathy with those that have suffered. So you have no real possibility to work through the terror genocide producing you, because you believe that genocide is something that doesn't affect you, but the direct victims. So I think that this understanding of genocide as the partial destruction of the national group means that we have lost something that was in ourselves, and think not only about Argentina, but all the paradigmatic cases. When you understand that if genocide is the destruction of Jews, so it is something that doesn't happen to the Germans, but if genocide is something that destroyed the social fabric in the whole Europe, so it transformed the German identity because the Jewish part of the German identity was suppressed, was destroyed. So the Germans also lost something that was part of themselves, and it is no more there. So it is not empathy. It's that something that was part of you was taken from you. So the understanding is totally different, but you are right. This understanding has very problematic consequences, but I think very powerful consequences too, regarding, for example, the question of reparations. So who should be repaired? In what way? Who will be part of this reparation process? So reparations means that only the direct groups will be repaired. So the social fabric will be reconstructed that way. I don't think so. I think it is really a very, I would say, in the worst way, a very mercantilistic view of identity. That the idea that, okay, I put the Jewish element of the German identity out, and then if I give you some money, I will repair the German identity or the Jewish identity. Not at all. So it is thinking just in the individual level, which is okay. I'm not against reparations. I think it is really problematic, all the discussion on reparation, either regarding Nazism, regarding Argentina, or any other cases. And it produces, sometimes it produces what I have called a symbolical enactment of genocidal social practices that you are trying to repair. Probably at an individual level, you will produce some kind of reparation, but at the price that in the social fabric, you will produce exactly the opposite, because it is much more difficult trying to reconstruct the Jewish part of the German identity than giving reparations. So it is much more challenging, this possibility for the German identities to understand something is lost in ourselves. We can continue being the same without this part of our identity. So we have a need to reconstruct, to recover, to work through the consequences of taking part of our identity out. So that is how it looks like somehow. And it was very interesting in some cases in Latin America, I would say in Argentina, but mainly in Colombia, which is really interesting the way in which reparations have been thought in Colombia at the collective level. This idea that if a community was destroyed, so what we need is not to give some money to the survivor members of the community, but to recreate the possibility of this community to be reconstructed. So there is a need of investment, but not in order to trying to, it is impossible in some way, because when something is destroyed, never it will be the same, but at least to feel that we have a duty, a moral commitment, trying to at least to deal with the consequences of this suppression. And it is not possible just to close very slightly the situation, just to saying, okay, I will give you some money and that's all. So I think it's much more complicated, and that's the trap, the real trap of this individual and mercantilistic understanding of reparations.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I will say that the reason reparations specifically came to mind when I was reading through this is that this is something, it's not an area that I focus on specifically, but this is something that comes up very frequently in the arenas in which I work, looking at, the ICC, trying to figure out sort of what type of reparations to give over, many years. And through experiences in Uganda, where that was, at least for a while, the one thing that everyone, and I say this very in a very generalizing way, but the one thing that many people could agree upon was that reparations were necessary. But what that meant was incredibly and is incredibly complicated, especially approaching things through this focus on, victim perpetrators and how not so much that impacts the individuals, but what will that do for the society going forward, right? And so it's a incredibly thorny question, but I would agree, an incredibly important one. And I don't think we do it any service by trying to simplify it, right? So I want to shift towards the end of the book, where you note, and this is coming from the book as well, the symbols and practices used to deny victims' identity, shift responsibility, and create an abstract representation of horror that is typically associated with the genocide are not created by the perpetrators. Rather, they are adaptive responses of the victims, their families, and society as a whole as the result of the systematic and widespread use of terror. In any process of recovery and healing, it is important to address these elements, but it's also important to recognize that the representation of these events must come from the victims and their communities rather than being imposed by the perpetrators. And I know that's a rather long quote that I've pulled, but for me, that really, this concept really brings sort of all the parts of your book together. And certainly conceptually, this complicates our ideas of how to work through a genocide. And this working through is a key focus and theme going through the entire book. What does this type of framing mean for transitional justice efforts? In other words, equipped with this understanding, where do we go from here?
Yeah, you are right that's why your reading was really thoughtful, because yes, this question and this element, and I would say the last chapter, the fifth chapter is the heart of the book, is the core, because it puts together all the levels, as you have said, in this way that we analyze in transitional justice usually, and in most of our social understanding, sociological or historical understandings of genocide, we take the assumption, we think the process as if everyone is working consciously. So this idea that the symbolical level is like the rest of the levels, so that perpetrators are trying to impose forgetting, and we are trying to recover memory. And again, that's an absolutely wrong perspective, because most of our mind is not conscious. So the level, the neurological level and the psychoanalytical level explain us that most of the work of our brain is non-conscious, and the psychoanalytical level realize the existence of the unconscious. So that's why, in my opinion, genocide, I made more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, a periodization, one of the periodization of genocide. And there are around 5, 6 different periodizations, but the difference of my own is that first, that there is a last stage after extermination, but the last stage is different than Greg Stanton's last stage, which is denial. It is much more complicated than denial, and I think it is symbolical enactment. And it is what you have pointed out very clearly, that this symbolical enactment of the genocide cannot be created by the perpetrators, because the perpetrators cannot be in our minds. So genocide is a bet. From the genociders is a bet. Is a bet with a very strong knowledge, very real knowledge about how memory works. So it is a bet that probably through terror, we will produce some representations of what happened that will be absolutely linked with the genocidal objectives. But it is not automatic. So it is another stage, and it is our own production. That's the problematic point. It is not the production of the genociders. The most effective representations regarding the genocidal objectives are not the representations of the genociders, but our own, because it is the consequence of terror. So the title of the whole trilogy, which is Working Through Genocide, is the idea that we can do something different with that. We have the possibility to do something different than the symbolical enactment of genocide. But for doing that, we have a really critical awareness of what happened. We have to work through the experience, to work through our terror, trying to defeat the terror in ourselves. So we need a process to produce something different. So to make the bet fail. But that's my idea. So the consequences for transitional justice are fundamental, because the idea of transitional justice is we need to put the memories of the victims instead of the memories of the perpetrators. That seems very simple, but it is not. Because which memories and who decide? So who is able to decide if some type of narrative is enacting symbolically the genocide or not? For doing that, we need to understand the main objective of genocide. But that's the real challenge, that usually it is not true that there are very different memories in the victims. There are very different narratives in the society. So which one of them is correct? So which one is the one we should choose in transitional justice in order to repair, in order to produce reparations? So I think that's really interesting. And I think we need these different elements from different disciplines to understand why terror produce some kind of representations, and how is the history of working through trauma, working through terror, in order to a better understanding of these consequences and the possibility to challenge it, to critically challenge these consequences. And one of them, we were talking about that in the previous question, is precisely our own involvement. So one of the clear ways of symbolical enactment of genocidal social practices is to put the experience beyond us. So that's an adaptive answer in which we put the terror out. So if we can represent genocide as something that happened to others, so the terror is not present. The terror in ourselves is not there. So I think one of the main challenges is trying to work through this installment of terror in the whole society, in ourselves. And what I have learned from the survivors of genocidal experiences, and it is paradoxical, it is that terror is much more effective in the people who were not interned in concentration camps than in the people that were interned. And the survivors of Argentina taught me that, teach me about that in a very deep way, because, and the reason is the non-limits of imagination. So what I have learned from the survivors, they explain me, is that to live a concentration camp experience is terrible and it produces a lot of marks in you, but it has a limit, the limit of the experience. The terrible things you have lived are absolutely unacceptable, maybe unmanageable, but there is a limitation, that it is the experience you have lived. But the imagination has no limits. So if you are terrified for a concentration camp society in which you could have been interned, but you never have been there, so your imagination has no limits. So the effects of terror is deeper. It is going even deeper because it is going without any kind of limits. So that's why the compelling process of the survivors in Argentina during the 90s, that was very important for our society, is that the survivors ask the rest of the society that, okay, they say that we have been working for 15 years about the consequences of genocide in ourselves, but now we are asking you, the rest of the society, because we don't know as survivors. So what happened to you? What was to live in a concentration camp society when you have never been in a concentration camp? So to know that there is a possibility you will be sent to a terrifying place like a concentration camps, you never went there. So then the situation finished, and what happened to you? So I think that's a fundamental question that usually societies doesn't make. So, and that's interesting that in the Argentinian case, the question was provoked, was produced by the survivors, not by the rest of, were the survivors who asked the rest of the society how it was to be an ordinary citizen in Argentina. We don't know. We know how it was to be a survivor of the concentration camp, how it was to be just an ordinary citizen.
Thank you. I think rather than switching gears again in the last few minutes, I want to follow up on that question, if you don't mind, and on your response to that question, rather. And sort of, what did society say back, right? When the survivors asked this question, but also asked Argentine society broadly to say, you know, now you need to do some work as well. What happened? I mean, what types of work did people do? I mean, this opens up all sorts of questions for me that certainly can't be dealt with in 4 minutes, but if you could speak a little bit on that, I think that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, I have 4 minutes. That's okay, Mel. Yeah. That's 4 minutes. Yeah, but Great. I will try to be more concrete. This question was produced in a couple of seminars that were organized in the School of Philosophy and Humanities in the University of Buenos Aires. It was 1997. And it is interesting, your question, what happened? That it was really interesting that it started the process in which the audience of this seminar started to analyze their own involvement in terror. But they never thought about that. They never thought about that because it seems it is not really important. What is important is the stories from people who actually lived the concentration camp experience. But as these people were asking you, but what about you? And it was great. And it was really important because there was a huge audience, and it was very important at the political level because there were different political representatives there. So it was really interesting, the process in which it was moved, the whole working through the Argentine experience. And I think that's a fundamental element in the Argentine fight against impunity. Remember, in those years, there was impunity in Argentina, and there was a whole process, and these events were part of this process of fighting and defeating impunity. So in 10 years later, the trials were reopened, but with a different participation of society, trying to understand that there were the trials for themselves too. They were not just the trials for the direct victims. Yeah, I have 2 more minutes. That's okay.
Thank you. So I don't want to launch into another question in 2 minutes. So I would just say, is there anything else that you would like to say about the book? I would highly recommend people get a copy, maybe show us the book.
Yeah, as Mel showed the previous one, that's the last one. Yeah, more recent representations of terror. Yeah.
But
No,
anyway.
okay, that's enough. I guess Mel was interested in the journey, but we had no time. But anyway, that the only thing I want to mention is that it took a lot of time just to learn. That was great, but just to learn from other disciplines in order to intertwine the different levels. That was in my feeling was that I can't work on memory as a sociologist without a real understanding of the other levels. So I started studying, I did an MA on neurosciences, trying to understand different elements. Then I studied for 3-4 years psychoanalysis in order to understand the Freudian perspective. But I guess it was fundamental to produce the book. So this book took around 10 years to be produced. It was published in Spanish 2012, but it took around 10 years from the early 20s, 20 something to 2012 to be published. And then the English version has been revised. So it is last year, so it is not the real book in Spanish, but the book in Spanish with many ads and revisions and whatever. But that was a great journey, just the possibility to learn. I'm very curious, so I love to learn from different disciplines, which are not my own.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for finishing with that. And in secret, it sounds like, are you really the Hulk in disguise with his 7 PhDs in different disciplines you've got going on there? I thank you so much, both of you, for such an engaging conversation. And I feel like once again, what this shows, Daniel, is the impact of your work. The dreaded I word that academics are always talking about. But your work certainly, definitely has that in Argentina. And this work is no exception to that. So it's a great work, and thank you for getting it translated so that those of us whose Spanish is not so muy bien can delve into it and read it as well. And of course, now I'm like with all of these webinars off to buy the book and read it. So thank you to Carse and to Daniel for taking the time to discuss Daniel's book in this webinar today. And this is just a reminder to everyone to keep an eye on the IAG's listserv, social media, and website for announcements of future webinars. And recordings of this webinar will be available in due course on the IAG's YouTube channel, where you can also find recordings of other past webinars and conference videos. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.